A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, do you remember a time when you were talking about Christian things and you had some doubts as to whether the things that you were sharing were true? Was there evidence? Well, these days, the sorts of things that people come up with when they are opposing Christian faith look like they need a little more evidence to convince us that there's any truth and reality in what they share. It looks to me as though our Christianity has got the foundation in place by which we can build our lives. And Bill Muehlenberg's been reflecting on some of the things that the world believes to be true, which are not really true. In fact, he's talking about a religion of unreality. Bill Muehlenberg's back with us. Hey, Bill, welcome back to 2020.
Good to be back again.
Bill, what inspires you to write about a religion of unreality?
Well, it's easy in some ways. One, we see it everywhere that we turn nowadays. And two, as I say in a recent piece, because I've got a interactive website, I get comments in all the time from, angry atheists or wild secular lefties who really don't like what I have to say. So they also give me a good reason to write about this. I think recently had a guy write in saying, you're mad, you're crazy. Everybody knows that climate change is real. It's proven. And only idiots don't believe it. And, it's all in capital letters, right? So they're really screaming at you. But it's always these same people, right, who talk about this is proven and this is true or this has got science that also tell you, right, men can be women, men can carry and have babies and all the rest. So, I tend to take with a grain of salt when I have people living in such a world of unreality and falsehood. I don't really take seriously much of what they have to say, whether it's climate change or anything else. So, yeah, we see quite a bit of that nowadays in the Western culture.
Bill, there's always what accompanies those claims, some level of insistence that science is on their side. Science has become the modern crutch. People used to talk about religion being a crutch, but now people need to have some sort of science to prove what they believe, even if it's not true.
Yep. No, that's right. And again, a Christian certainly isn't anti-science. What we are against is scientism. The idea that only that which science can explain is true, right? If science can't talk about it, then it can't exist or it can't be real, which is foolish because science can't talk about art or beauty or, love, all kinds of things that we all know to be real, to be true, to be important. So again, science properly understood is fine, but it's this disconnect often from reality, from truth. When people push various agendas or worldviews, that's when we can get into a lot of strife, because often their worldview, unlike the biblical worldview, does not correspond with the real world. In fact, they're at loggerheads with each other.
So when someone is claiming their truth and we're claiming our truth, I imagine that we need to be a little prepared for how we defend the fact that we have a truth that we stand on. How do you like to address those sorts of things, reality and truth?
And I know where you're coming from, but I'd say even there, when people say this is my truth, of course, the Christian says, well, no, it's not a question of my truth or your truth. It's a question of the truth. What is true? What matters that we align ourselves with what actually is, what is true. But yeah, way too often people will say, well, you got your truth, I got mine, and as if it's like a preference for what kind of ice cream you like, chocolate or vanilla. No, truth claims are more than personal preference, so we have to make sure what you're claiming to be true actually lines up with reality. So in my recent piece on this, I give a few examples of what that might look like.
Is it true, too, that when you are engaging with someone who has this sort of relativism, they don't actually know what's true, but they're happy to argue their truth, and maybe we're on the same level sometimes, trying to argue what we argue as Christians, but not really absolutely convinced that what we're saying is true, but this idea of relativism, that anything can be true at any particular time, that in itself doesn't make a lot of sense, does it?
Well, it doesn't. I mean, if you're a true relativist, and I don't think you can be, well, then you have to say even your insistence that relativism is absolutely true, well, that can't be, right? If everything is relative, then even your claim that everything is relative is relative. In other words, it can't be, latched onto or firmly adhered to. It's just as dodgy as anything else. So unless there are some absolutes, some truth that we can bank on, well, then we're all in strife. And so I use different examples on this. A person can claim, the law of gravity, that's just a human invention, a man-made construct, and so on, Well, the simple answer there is tell a guy to climb a tall tree and then ask him to take a few steps and see what happens. Pretty soon you'll find himself on the ground flat as a pancake. And guess who's won? The law of gravity won, not this guy's relativism or not this guy's skepticism. The real world will always trump dodgy belief systems, and that includes relativism and the idea that there is no ultimate reality.
Bill, for the believer listening right now, saying, how can I hang my faith on some really solid foundations so that I'm not in this relativist unreality? I'm just mindful of in the beginning God. If we understand and think through the issue that there must be a creator, and we can align him then with the scriptures and with Jesus Christ, in the beginning God. But if I don't have that foundation at all, I'm a bit vulnerable, aren't I, to believing anything?
Oh, yeah, unless there's some kind of absolute truth out there, objective truth outside of your own feelings and beliefs. We've got nothing to hang on to. Hopefully some people at least will believe there's things like, say, the truths of mathematics and so on, things that happen to be true and we can all appeal to. But if you're really going to push this idea that there is no objective truth or reality, well, your spin is as good as anybody else's, and some people's spin is pretty bad. Hitler's view of reality was not so good, and it was very costly. So again, we can nail this down a bit more by saying truth is that which corresponds to reality. And I like to say a good roadmap is a case in point, right? Well, today you'd say a good properly working GPS. Example, I live in Melbourne. If I'm telling you I want to head your way up to Brisbane, most people looking at a map will say, oh, that's north. Okay, so probably I should head north if I'm driving. But if my map or my GPS tells me to head due south, well, look, I'm not going to make it to Brizzy, that's for sure, and I'll probably get baptized in Port Phillip Bay, right? If I go too far south, I'm going to be in the water. So a good map is just that. It corresponds to the real world. And truth is like that, or should be like that. The Bible, we believe, is God's truth. So it corresponds to the way the world is, the way the world works, the way we are as people. But a lot of other worldviews, non-Christian belief systems, they don't seem to really cohere with reality, and they can be, picked apart on that basis.
What I love is on this program to be able to talk to experts who can put us in a good context. In other words, what inspires me is that we can talk about all of the other religions of the world. We can talk about all of the philosophies of the world. And we can be confident that we can actually come from a place of truth, because there are Christian answers to all of these other things that we might even describe as unrealities. Bill, what does it do for our faith, do you think, when we've come to a conclusion that our reality is true, that God is real, that he is creator, that he sent his son who died and rose? what does that do for the believer and for their life?
Well, it should do a fair amount to know that, not so much that we know everything about there is to know, but we have a God who is true. We have his word, which is true. And again, it doesn't tell us everything about reality, but it tells us enough that we can live confidently a life that is, going to be worthwhile. That's going to help ourselves. That's going to help others. And again, contrast that with, say, another worldview, like, say, some of the Eastern religions, right, which tend to deny reality. They say this material world is a world of illusion. Right and wrong are kind of two sides of the same coin. It's all a nice theory, but does it really help us to live in the real world? And one example I give in my article by the late Francis Schaeffer, right, the Christian apologist, had this wonderful ministry in the mountains of Switzerland called L'Abri. Young people going from Europe to the East, India, and so on, looking for a guru or coming back the other way, would often stop at L'Abri. Schaeffer would get lectures, Q&A. And again, the same thing, all the people searching for truth, for answers, found a lot while they're there. And one of the stories I like that goes way back, Schaeffer had just done a lecture on the reality of truth, of moral absolutes. And there was a student from India, a young man there, who, of course, pushed all the Eastern worldview stuff. So, there was this disconnect between, well, obviously what we would say is the real world and what he thought it was. So Schaeffer very wisely and kind of cheekily, there was a kettle of boiling water for somebody's cup of tea, I guess. He grabbed it and walked to this Indian guy and held it over his head, to which the young man promptly stood up and walked out of the room, right? In other words, he was caught out. The hard reality of, things like boiling water shows that, yeah, there is a real world, A, and B, there is such a thing as right and wrong. Making a cup of tea is a good thing, but if you pour it over somebody's head, that's a bad thing. So that little case study that Schaeffer did there was he could have spent hours philosophically going back and forth, but he caught this guy and his worldview out by showing, hey, if you're not a Christian with a Christian worldview, there's going to be a conflict along the line between your own worldview and the world that you live in.
When we're comparing our view of the world, Bill, with other views, there's a certain sense in which just believing what we believe doesn't make it true in itself, because what we need to do is find evidence. And we need to add precept upon precept, add truth onto the foundations that we've got to explore those things. Just a little something personally here. How relevant is it to move in and out of a place of doubt and back to an understanding of reality? Because to me, this would seem like it's natural progress that the Christian might even go through times. You might even call it a crisis of belief because you're having doubts. But that can actually be the sort of thing that drives you to an answer, isn't it? Looking for that evidence for God's truth.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And since I'm referring to this piece I just penned, earlier colleague of Francis Schaeffer was Os Guinness. And he's written a lot on, in fact, he did a whole book on doubt and said there's a good place for a doubt, right? If it leads us to question things, as you say, to want us to pursue what is true, the fact that you're not content just with whatever you were born with or what your parents taught you, as good as that might be, but to keep searching, to keep looking, and to say, well, maybe I don't have all the answers here. Maybe I need to explore this more, do some more research. So doubt can be a companion to faith. It's not actually the opposite. Unbelief would be the opposite of faith, but having real questions, looking for real answers, well, that's all right. And, Peter says, always be ready to give a reason for the hope that lies within you. So if people are looking, have honest questions, we should be there to give them honest answers to help steer them in the right direction and maybe help deal with some of the doubts they might entertain.
Sometimes we think of blind faith, and that might be the sort of faith, and we can't always be completely enlightened in our faith because we might need to know everything for that to happen. But people talk about blind faith, don't have blind faith. But I guess we need to establish the foundations and the reasons, the truth by which we can form as a foundation for what we do to make sense of the world, so that we're not living inauthentically and being in an unreal world. What are your thoughts, just as we tie some loose ends together? How do we just make sense of the fact that as Christians, we need to have a foundation to be able to show us that we're not just floating and drifting?
Yeah, well, and until recently, most people lived that way, right? They did believe there is such a thing as right and wrong, true and false. Most people, even if they weren't Christians, probably believed, yeah, there's probably a God, there's probably such a thing as sin. But today, as we mentioned, with some of the madness, absolute madness, like the trans agenda, where you can just believe utter nonsense with a straight face. You can actually claim, yeah, I'm a guy, but I can have babies, and people get mad at you if you actually question that. So it's even worse today when we've rejected absolute truth, and more the state is getting involved. That's the scary bit, right? Where the state now persecutes you. Perhaps you're a teacher and you tell a student who thinks he is a she, well, you're not, or teacher doesn't use the preferred pronouns. More and more today, you can lose your job. The state is actively persecuting you if you want to live in a world of truth and reality, and it's affirming those who want to live in delusion. So things have really gotten a whole lot worse, and that makes our job as Christians even more urgent. We claim to know truth, and it's what most people always knew all along. Nobody ever thought a man could become a woman just by hoping it was the case. So today we got a bit of a bigger job on our hands, but we have the old same truth claims, and we can share that with others, and some will be open and hopefully receive it. But we have to live lives of integrity, and we have to live by truth in a world that really is starved of both truth and reality.
So truth is that thing that will make us immune from living in a world of unreality. And it starts with believing there is a God and that he is absolute. Wonderful insights, as always, Bill Muehlenberg. For listeners who might want to read a little more about this, one of the latest articles Bill has written, The Religion of Unreality, and you can find that at billmuehlenberg.com or simply Google Culture Watch, one word. Bill, always great getting your insights. Thanks so much for joining us again today on 2020.
Thanks again, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.